Hey guys, welcome back to this channel, The Voice of the Past. In this video, we will unfold the untold story of the Blackwood family's Masquerade Ball, A Night of Lies. Before continuing, if you are new into this channel, please consider subscribing to this channel. Let's start. The Blackwood family's annual Masquerade Ball was a spectacle of excess, shrouded in mystery and whispered intrigue. For decades, the event had drawn the most elite figures of Ravenhollow, aristocrats, politicians, and socialites, all lured by the promise of an unforgettable night. But this year, something was different. The invitation arrived in a black velvet envelope, its gold wax seal embossed with the Blackwood crest, an intricate emblem of two ravens perched upon a twisted oak. The card inside was perfumed with something faintly floral yet bitter, as though laced with something unnatural. The words, written in a delicate, almost archaic script, read, "The Blackwood family cordially invites you to a night of revelry and wonder. Come masked, for the night belongs to mystery. Come prepared, for not all masks shall be removed." At the bottom of the card, in a different ink, scrawled as though hastily added, was a second message. "Come masked, but beware. Some masks never come off." Eleanor Hawthorne's fingers trembled as she traced the words. She had spent years investigating the Blackwood family, uncovering rumors of their illicit dealings, mysterious disappearances, suspicious deaths, and whispered claims of something even darker lurking within their legacy. Yet, despite her efforts, she had never been able to pierce the veil of secrecy that cloaked the Blackwoods. Until now. Eleanor wasn't just attending the ball to revel in the decadence of the elite. She was here to find the truth. The arrival. The Blackwood Estate stood on the edge of Ravenhollow, a monstrous Gothic mansion nestled within a vast, fog-laden forest. Tall iron gates, rusted yet imposing, loomed over the grand entrance. As Eleanor's carriage approached, the gate slowly creaked open on its own, revealing a winding stone pathway leading toward the estate. At the entrance, masked guests stepped out of sleek black carriages, their gowns shimmering under the golden glow of hanging lanterns. Their laughter echoed eerily through the night, though none of them truly seemed at ease. Eleanor adjusted her black lace mask, her pulse quickening. She had chosen her attire carefully, an elegant yet understated black gown, its fabric flowing like liquid shadow around her as she moved. A journalist in disguise, she carried a small notebook hidden in her garter, along with a silver pen that doubled as a dagger. She had come prepared for anything, or so she thought. As she ascended the grand marble steps, the mansion's towering door swung open. A butler in a stark white mask, expressionless except for hollow eyes, stood in the entryway. "Welcome, Miss Hawthorne," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. She froze. She hadn't given her real name. Before she could question him, the butler stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. The moment she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her with a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. The ballroom inside, the Blackwood Ballroom, was a masterpiece of decadence. Gilded chandeliers hung from a ceiling painted with celestial frescoes, their crystals catching the flickering candlelight. Red velvet drapes framed the towering windows, but the view beyond was nothing but an endless darkness. A live orchestra played a waltz, a haunting melody that felt both enchanting and suffocating. The guests twirled across the polished black and gold marble floors, their masks hiding both beauty and deception. Eleanor's gaze swept across the room, searching. And then she saw them. The Blackwoods stood at the top of the grand staircase, overseeing the night's festivities like gods among mortals. At the center stood Victor Blackwood, the patriarch. Even behind his sleek silver mask, His piercing blue eyes held an unnatural sharpness, as if he could see straight through the masks of others. His wife, Margaret Blackwood, draped in a gown of ice-blue silk, stood beside him, her smile too perfect to be real. Flanking them were their children, Julian and Lillian Blackwood, twins, dressed in matching obsidian masks that made them almost indistinguishable. Their gazes swept the ballroom with an unreadable intensity. Eleanor felt a pulse of unease. She had read about the Blackwood heirs, but something about them seemed off. Their movements were too synchronized, their expressions too controlled. It was as if they were playing a role in a scripted performance, one that had been rehearsed for centuries. She barely had time to dwell on it before she felt a presence at her back. A cold whisper brushed against her ear. "You shouldn't have come." Eleanor spun around. No one was there, only shadows flickering beneath the candlelight. Her breath hitched. She wasn't paranoid. Someone had spoken those words. Someone who didn't want her here. The grandfather clock in the far corner chimed midnight. And then, a scream shattered the illusion of elegance. The music halted abruptly, the last note ringing through the ballroom like a death knell. The guests froze. Whispers of confusion rippled through the masked figures. Eleanor turned toward the source of the sound, her pulse hammering. At the foot of the grand staircase, a man lay sprawled across the marble floor. His golden mask had fallen away, revealing a pale, lifeless face. His throat was slit from ear to ear, the blood pooling in a crimson arc across the polished floor. Gasps filled the ballroom. But it wasn't just the murder that sent a wave of dread through Eleanor. It was the way the Blackwood family stood motionless, watching the scene unfold without a hint of surprise. And then Victor Blackwood stepped forward, lifting a single gloved hand to silence the murmuring crowd. His voice was calm, too calm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "the games have begun." A hushed silence swallowed the ballroom as Victor Blackwood's words settled over the guests like a death sentence. The games have begun. The lifeless body at the foot of the staircase bled into the marble, his golden mask resting beside his outstretched hand. Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps as she studied the scene. Who was he? Had someone recognized him? No one moved. No one screamed anymore. It was as if they had been expecting this. Victor descended the staircase with the grace of a seasoned performer. His silver mask reflected the candlelight as he gazed over the assembled guests, his presence commanding, suffocating. "My friends," he said, his voice smooth, almost amused, "it seems our night has taken an unfortunate turn." Eleanor clenched her fists. Unfortunate? A man was just murdered in the middle of his ballroom. The orchestra remained silent. The masked guests stood frozen, torn between terror and something else, something darker, anticipation. Victor turned to a tall, slender man in a white mask, the butler who had greeted Eleanor. "Mr. Quinn, please ensure our guest is removed." The butler bowed and with an eerie lack of urgency signaled for two silent footmen to approach. They lifted the body as if it were no heavier than an afterthought. Eleanor's stomach churned. Where were they taking him? She turned to the guest nearest to her, a man in a red and black harlequin mask. But before she could speak, he placed a gloved finger to his lips. "Shh," he whispered, his voice filled with something between amusement and warning. The hair on the back of Eleanor's neck stood on end. Victor clapped his hands together. Now, let's not allow one little accident to ruin the night." After all, he glanced toward the guests, his sharp gaze landing on Eleanor for just a second too long. "Isn't that why we wear masks? To hide what lurks beneath?" A ripple of uneasy laughter swept through the crowd, and just like that the tension shifted. The music started again, a waltz, slower this time, more deliberate, as if the orchestra understood that the night had just changed. Victor raised his glass. A toast, he declared, to secrets, shadows, and the thrill of the unknown. The guests lifted their glasses, some with shaking hands, others with eerie composure. Eleanor did the same, her mind racing. There was something wrong with this place. And yet, no one left. Not a single person made for the grand doors, not even as a murder had just played out before them. Because they knew. Because they had expected it. And Eleanor was beginning to suspect that this was just the beginning. A dance of deception. Eleanor knew she had to act quickly. She had come here for a story, but this was something far worse than anything she had anticipated. She weaved through the crowd, careful not to draw attention, but she could feel eyes on her, watching, waiting. Her gaze landed on a woman in a white swan mask, standing near the ornate fireplace. Something about her seemed out of place, her grip on her wine glass too tight, her shoulders too tense. Eleanor approached her. "Did you know him?" she asked in a hushed tone. The woman's fingers trembled around the stem of her glass. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Instead, she subtly shook her head. "No," she whispered, "but it doesn't matter. None of this matters." "What do you mean?" Eleanor pressed. The woman hesitated, then leaned in so close that Eleanor could smell the faint trace of jasmine perfume on her skin. "They already knew," she whispered. "About him. About everything." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Before she could ask another question, a hand landed on her arm. She whirled, heart hammering. A man in a raven-black mask stood before her, his grip firm but not painful. His voice was calm, yet there was a warning beneath it. "I wouldn't ask too many questions if I were you," he murmured. Eleanor pulled her arm free. "And who exactly are you?" He tilted his head slightly. "A man who still wants to leave here alive." Her breath hitched. "Are we in danger?" His silence was answer enough. And then, without another word, he disappeared into the throng of dancers. Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears. Something terrible was happening here, and she had a sinking feeling that by the end of the night she would learn exactly what it was. The masked man. The evening continued as if nothing had happened. The Blackwoods mingled with their guests, laughter and whispers intertwining in the candlelight. But the air had changed. Eleanor felt it in the way people moved, the way they spoke in carefully measured tones. She caught glimpses of subtle exchanges, notes passed behind gloved fingers, fleeting looks filled with unspoken meaning. And then she saw him. A man in the exact same golden mask as the one the dead man had worn. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. It was impossible. But there he was, standing near the far end of the ballroom, his face obscured, his posture eerily similar. No one else seemed to notice. Eleanor took a step forward, then another. The masked man turned, and for a single, paralyzing second, their eyes met. His lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. And then the lights flickered, the music stuttered, and when the room was illuminated again, he was gone. Eleanor's heart pounded. She turned frantically, searching the crowd, but there was no sign of the golden masked man. Her mind screamed at her that it was a trick, a hallucination, a coincidence. But her gut told her the truth. The man who had been murdered was somehow still here, and he was watching her. Eleanor's breath was shallow as she scanned the ballroom, searching for the golden-masked man who had disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared. The candlelight flickered, casting eerie shadows against the towering columns, but there was no sign of him. Had she imagined it? Number? She was certain of what she saw, but before she could dwell on it, a delicate hand grasped her wrist. "Walk with me," a soft voice murmured. Eleanor turned to see Lillian Blackwood, her obsidian mask making her expression unreadable. The Blackwood daughter's pale fingers were cool against Eleanor's skin as she gently pulled her toward the balcony doors. The night air was sharp against Eleanor's skin as they stepped outside. Below them, the estate grounds stretched into twisting gardens, the hedge maze looming in the distance like a labyrinth of secrets. The music from the ballroom hummed behind them, muffled by the heavy curtains. "You shouldn't have come," Lillian said, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor studied her. "I've heard that before tonight." Lillian's lips curved slightly, but there was no amusement in her eyes. "Then perhaps you should start listening." "Who was the man who was murdered?" Eleanor pressed. "And why did I just see him alive?" Lillian exhaled slowly, tilting her face toward the moonlight. "You didn't see him alive," she said. "You saw his mask." Eleanor frowned. "What does that mean?" Lillian's gaze flickered back to her, a rare moment of something human flashing behind her dark eyes. Fear. But before she could answer, a loud crash erupted from inside the ballroom. Eleanor spun toward the doors as the sound of shattered glass and screams filled the air. A second body. The guests had scattered toward the edges of the ballroom, their extravagant gowns and masks forming a sea of panicked elegance. At the center of the room, a table lay overturned, wine and broken glass pooling at its feet, and on the floor, a second body. A woman in a crimson dress, her silver mask cracked down the center. Her head was twisted at an unnatural angle, her unseeing eyes staring at the ceiling. This was no accident. Someone was hunting. Victor Blackwood stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Twice in one night," he murmured. "How unfortunate." But Eleanor saw it again. That same lack of shock, the same eerie calm. This wasn't misfortune. It was expected. Julian Blackwood's voice cut through the murmurs. "I suggest no one leaves the ballroom until we have this sorted." Eleanor clenched her fists. Sorted? This wasn't a misplaced glass of wine. 2 people were dead, and the Blackwoods spoke as if it were an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. Her instincts screamed at her. She needed to find out the truth before she became the next body on the floor. The ballroom doors slammed shut, the heavy iron locks clicking into place. A murmur of unease spread through the masked guests as Julian Blackwood raised a hand. "No one leaves until we have answers." Eleanor's pulse quickened. She could feel it. The atmosphere had changed. The air was thick with paranoia, whispers slithering between the guests. 2 bodies, 2 deaths. And yet, no one was running, because they knew. This was a game, and the only way out was to play. Victor Blackwood surveyed the room, his silver mask gleaming under the chandeliers. His voice was smooth, practiced. "We must be careful now. The night is still young and, well," his lips curled into something resembling a smile. "The wrong move could be costly." Eleanor clenched her fists. "They're toying with us." She caught a movement from the corner of her eye, Lillian Blackwood, retreating toward the back of the room. Without hesitation, Eleanor followed. The secret passage. Lillian slipped behind a velvet curtain near the grand fireplace. Eleanor hesitated only a second before ducking in after her. The space behind the curtain was narrow, suffocating, lit only by a single wall-mounted candle. A hidden wooden door loomed before them, its surface ancient and cracked. Lillian didn't turn. "You shouldn't be here." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "Neither should you." Lillian let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "That's where you're wrong." She placed her hand on the door, hesitating. "This house, it's not what you think it is. The Blackwoods. We are not what you think we are." Eleanor's breath hitched. "Then tell me." But before Lillian could answer, a loud knock sounded from the other side of the door. 3 deliberate raps, slow, measured. Lillian's entire body went rigid. Her hand snapped away from the door handle. Eleanor reached for it, but Lillian grabbed her wrist, her nails digging into Eleanor's skin. "Don't!" she hissed. Eleanor hesitated. "Who's in there?" Lillian shook her head, her voice a whisper. "It's not about who." She turned to Eleanor, her dark eyes flashing. "It's about what?" The third death, before Eleanor could demand more, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the walls, followed by another scream. They bolted from behind the curtain just as the guests backed away from the center of the room. A third body lay crumpled on the floor. This time, Eleanor recognized him. The man in the golden mask. The very same one she had seen watching her just minutes ago. But now, his mask was split in half, revealing a pale, expressionless face. Blood pooled beneath him, but his body was too still, too unnatural. And that was when Eleanor noticed the horrified expressions of the guests around her, not because they had just witnessed another death, but because they had seen him die once before. A heavy silence smothered the ballroom as the guests recoiled from the third body sprawled across the marble floor. The golden mask, now split in half, revealed pale, lifeless features. The same man who had been murdered earlier in the night. Eleanor's breath hitched. This isn't possible. Her mind raced for an explanation. Was it a twin? A double? But deep in her gut, she knew there was something far worse at play. The Blackwood family remained still, their expressions betraying no shock, no horror, only calm indifference. Then Victor Blackwood sighed. "Well," he said, his voice casual, "this is getting rather inconvenient, isn't it?" A few guests let out nervous laughter, but the tension remained thick, unrelenting. Margaret Blackwood stepped forward, tilting her head as she studied the corpse. "It seems the past refuses to stay buried." Eleanor clenched her fists. The past? What were they talking about? The butler, Mr. Quinn, appeared beside Victor as if summoned from the shadows. "Shall I have this one removed as well, sir?" Victor waved a hand dismissively, as if the dead man was nothing more than spilled wine on the floor. "Yes, yes, before he stains the rug." Eleanor stepped forward before she could stop herself. "That's it?" she demanded. "You're not even going to question this? The same man has died twice." All eyes turned toward her. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, but others simply watched, some with curiosity, others with something more dangerous. Victor's cold blue gaze settled on her. "Miss Hawthorne, is it?" Eleanor's pulse spiked. How did he know her name? Victor smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. "You ask many questions, questions that, I assure you, have very old answers." Eleanor met his gaze head-on. "Then why don't you give them to me?" Victor chuckled. "Because, my dear, not all truths are meant to be spoken aloud." Lillian tensed beside her, a barely perceptible movement, but Eleanor noticed. "She's afraid." Julian Blackwood stepped forward, his dark eyes gleaming beneath his mask. "Perhaps our guest needs some fresh air. The night can be overwhelming." Eleanor's stomach twisted. Was this a warning or a threat? But before she could respond, the grandfather clock chimed 1, and suddenly, the candles flickered, casting the ballroom in dancing shadows. A gust of wind rushed through the room, though the windows remained shut. The chandeliers above swayed, their crystals clinking softly against one another. And then, the corpse on the floor moved. A choked gasp escaped Eleanor's lips as the man's hand twitched, his fingers curling slightly. The guests stumbled back, horrified yet transfixed. A wet, raspy breath filled the air. Then, the body sat up. The house remembers. A collective gasp rippled through the room as the dead man lifted his head, His golden mask was shattered, revealing pale, waxy skin, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears. He was dead. He was dead. The man's lips parted as if to speak, but instead of words, a deep, shuddering breath escaped his throat like a soul being pulled from somewhere far away. Then, his gaze snapped to Eleanor. She took a step back. His eyes were wrong, clouded but aware, like he recognized her. A strangled whisper left his lips. "You shouldn't be here." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Victor sighed dramatically. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Quinn, take care of this." The butler nodded once before stepping toward the reanimated corpse, pulling something from his coat, a silver dagger gleaming in the candlelight. Before Eleanor could react, Quinn drove the dagger deep into the man's throat. A sickening gurgle filled the air. The man collapsed again, his body seizing before falling still. The silence was unbearable. Then Victor clapped his hands together. "There. That should keep him down this time." Eleanor's hands shook. What the hell is happening in this house? Margaret Blackwood sighed, shaking her head. "Honestly, Victor, we should have done this years ago." Eleanor turned to Lillian, who stood rigid beside her, her breathing unsteady. "You knew this would happen," Eleanor whispered. Lillian didn't look at her. "The house remembers," she murmured. Eleanor frowned. "What does that mean?" Lillian finally met her gaze. "This house," she whispered, "does not let go of its dead." The forbidden wing. Eleanor knew she had to get out of the ballroom. She had to find answers. While the guests murmured amongst themselves, still shaken, Eleanor slipped toward the far side of the room, where a darkened hallway led deeper into the mansion. She felt a presence behind her. Lillian. Eleanor turned to her. "You're coming with me?" Lillian's jaw tightened. "I can't stop you, but I can warn you, there are places in this house you don't want to see." Eleanor exhaled. "And yet, you're still following me." Lillian didn't respond. Together they disappeared into the shadows. The hallway was silent, the flickering wall sconces barely illuminating the path ahead. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Then, Eleanor saw it. A single door at the end of the corridor. Unlike the rest of the estate, which was pristine and lavish, this door was rotting, its wood blackened with age, as if it had been left untouched for centuries. A heavy chain was wrapped around the handles, rusted but unbroken, and above it, carved into the wood, was a single word, a name, Graham Blackwood. Eleanor turned to Lillian, but before she could speak, the candles flickered out. A low whisper curled through the darkness. "You came too late." Then, the door burst open on its own, and something stepped out. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but pitch-black darkness beyond. A frigid gust of air rushed past Eleanor, carrying the scent of decay and old wood, as if the room had been sealed for centuries. Lillian grabbed Eleanor's wrist, her grip ice-cold. "We need to leave," she whispered, but Eleanor couldn't move. Something shifted inside the darkness, a presence, heavy, watching, and then a figure stepped out, tall, gaunt, clad in a tattered black cloak, its face obscured by a golden mask identical to the one the dead man had worn. A collective shiver ran through Eleanor's spine. "You came too late," the figure whispered again, its voice layered, as if multiple voices spoke at once. Eleanor's heartbeat slammed against her ribs. "Who are you?" The figure tilted its head, the golden mask catching the dim candlelight. "Graham Blackwood," it murmured. Lillian's breath hitched. Eleanor's mind reeled. Graham Blackwood. The missing heir. The Blackwood no one spoke about. Victor Blackwood had 2 sons, but only one had been seen in public. "He should be dead," Lillian whispered beside her. The masked figure laughed softly, The sound hollow, wrong. I was. Then, a flash of movement. Before Eleanor could react, Graham lunged toward her. The Blackwood curse Lillian shoved Eleanor backward, just as the door slammed shut behind Graham. The force sent them sprawling onto the cold marble floor of the hallway. Eleanor scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. What the hell was that? Lillian's face was ashen. You don't understand. Graham wasn't just missing. He was erased. Eleanor's stomach turned. Erased? Lillian exhaled shakily. The Blackwood family. We are cursed. Eleanor clenched her fists. I don't believe in curses. Lillian's eyes flashed. Then explain why a dead man just walked out of a locked room. Eleanor couldn't. Lillian pressed a trembling hand against the old door. Graham was my brother. He was supposed to inherit the estate. But he found out the truth about this house, about what it does. Eleanor shivered. What does it do? Lillian's voice dropped to a whisper. It doesn't let go. The house that eats the dead. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Eleanor turned just as Victor Blackwood emerged from the shadows, his silver mask gleaming in the dim light. Now, he mused, clasping his hands behind his back. I did warn you, Miss Hawthorne. Some masks should never come off. Eleanor took a step back, her skin crawling. What is Graham? Victor sighed as if bored. A memory, a mistake, a reminder of what happens when one digs too deep. Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears. You killed him. Victor chuckled. Oh, my dear. I wished I had. The walls around them shuddered, a deep groaning sound vibrating through the very foundations of the house. Eleanor's breath hitched. The house was alive. The Blackwood Estate, Lillian whispered, doesn't just house the dead. It keeps them. Victor's expression remained impassive. You see, Miss Hawthorne, the Blackwood legacy is not one of wealth or power. It is one of sacrifice. This house, it feeds on us, on our blood, our secrets, our lives. Those who die within its walls do not leave. Eleanor's stomach churned. Victor's cold blue gaze locked onto hers. And now, Miss Hawthorne, you are part of its story too. The last dance. A terrible noise erupted from the ballroom, the sound of rushing wind, of whispers, of laughter that wasn't human. The doors burst open, and Eleanor was dragged inside by an unseen force. The ballroom was no longer the place of glittering chandeliers and golden masks. The walls shifted, twisting into something endless and dark. The guests. They weren't guests anymore. They were specters, their masks fused to their faces, their bodies fading in and out of existence. And in the center, Grand Blackwood stood waiting. Eleanor's vision blurred. The waltz music warped, slowing down as if the very air was suffocating under the weight of something ancient. Victor's voice rang through the abyss. Dance, Miss Hawthorne. Eleanor tried to move, to fight, but the house held her in place. A gloved hand reached for hers. Graham's hand, cold, unyielding. You must dance, or you will never leave. Lillian's scream cut through the void. Eleanor, don't let him touch you. But it was too late. Graham pulled her into the dance. The ballroom spun, reality unraveling. The walls twisted into a maze of mirrors, each reflection showing Eleanor's face warping, aging, distorting, disappearing. You belong to the house now. Eleanor gasped for air. No, I don't. Graham's grip tightened. Then take my place. Eleanor's mind snapped into focus. That was it. The house needed someone to stay. With a surge of strength, she yanked free. The waltz collapsed into silence. The mirrors shattered. The house screamed. The final mask. Eleanor hit the floor hard, gasping for breath. The ballroom was back to normal. The chandeliers, the guests, the music, all as if nothing had happened. But Eleanor knew. She turned to where Graham had stood. Only his mask remained. A hush fell over the room as Victor Blackwood slowly approached, bending down to retrieve the golden mask. He studied it for a moment, then turned his icy gaze on Eleanor. "You survived," he murmured. "How unexpected." Eleanor's legs trembled as she pushed herself up. "I'm leaving." Victor smiled. "Are you?" She turned to the ballroom doors, now wide open. The fog outside had lifted. Lillian stepped beside her, voice urgent. "Go now, before the house changes its mind." Eleanor didn't need to be told twice. She ran. The night swallowed her whole as she burst into the open air, stumbling toward the gates. She didn't dare look back. As she reached the entrance, she heard Victor's voice one last time. "Until next year, Miss Hawthorne." Then the gate slammed shut behind her, and the Blackwood Masquerade Ball was over. For now. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more stories like this, hit that like button and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. And let me know on which topic you would like to see stories next. And check out these other stories you might enjoy. See you in the next one. Till then, take care and goodbye.